Of all the reactionary canon, there are perhaps no men as difficult to categorize as Thomas Carlyle. Part theologian, part scholar, part journalist, part society man. On the one hand, famous for his foul temper, on the other, famous for his often wondrous wit and sense of humour. A famous man of his era, but never truly among the others. Always working, and never abating his critical strength, Carlyle authored works which, even today, leave scholars perplexed and troubled by the observations within them. As this channel's contribution to Carlyle Day, I present The Irascible Life of Thomas Carlyle. On what I imagine was a stereotypically cold and harsh day in the Scottish countryside, Thomas Carlyle was born on the 4th of December 1795 in Ecclefechan, a tiny village of Dumfries and Galloway. He was born to James Carlyle, a stonemason by profession. Of his mother Margaret Carlyle, we know comparatively little. Carlyle's father was apparently quite successful in his trade, as he had the means to educate the young Thomas all the way through his childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood in independent institutions. Carlyle was sent to the Annan Academy, but was, according to later literature, bullied so relentlessly that he did not attend for more than 3 years. At this point, I should note that actual first-hand recollections of Carlyle's early years are very difficult to come by. Indeed, practically nothing was written about this period by the man himself, so we mostly rely on the works of late Victorian biographers from 1880 onwards to piece together a narrative. During his childhood, Carlyle's father instilled in him a deeply Calvinist way of being and of thinking about the world. Perhaps most prominent of the tenets instilled was Carlyle's great estimation of the power of hard work. Perhaps there never was a better defender of the, quote, Protestant work ethic than him. Both of Carlyle's parents wanted him to become a clergyman, and in order to gain the academic component necessary for this career, he was sent off to the University of Edinburgh in 1810 at the age of 15. It is impossible to understate what a colossal change in intellectual circumstances this was for the young man. For almost 200 years, Scotland's capital had undergone what is known as the Scottish Enlightenment. Universities had sprung up everywhere, funded by the wealth of both landowners and merchants. The vast wealth generated by a cabal of Scottish tobacco merchants made Edinburgh one of the wealthiest, most learned, and most attractive capitals in Europe. Countless intellectual people had appeared in the 1700s and continued to in the early 1800s when Thomas Carlyle first came to the city. James Boswell and James Macpherson had firmly established that Scottish authors were capable of great feats in English letters, the former in prose with his Life of Samuel Johnson, and the latter in verse with his Ossian cycle. Indeed, the Ossian poems became internationally adored throughout the continent, and can be accredited perhaps more than any other work with launching the Romantic movement in Germany. It held an immense influence over Goethe, who of course would later be a person of enormous scholarly interest to Carlyle. In the field of economics, Adam Smith had essentially launched what we now know as economics, with his Wealth of Nations, and Lord Monboddo had published major works in the field of linguistics. David Hume had essentially completely reshaped philosophy throughout his life, and his works on humanity and empiricism had by then become so influential throughout Europe that practically all major philosophers from then on would draw from his work with varying degrees of influence. Another area in which the Edinburgh-based intellectuals excelled was mathematics, and increasingly, rather than theology, Carlyle seemed to be drawn to this subject as a major passion. Nevertheless, he completed his degree in divinity 3 years later. However, during his time at Edinburgh, Carlyle basically lost his Christian faith. This is not to say he became an atheist, but rather that he could find no system of worship in which to place his faith. He grew skeptical of orthodox practices of worship. He was perhaps a deist in the mould of Lord Monboddo, but certainly, even though he ceased to practice formally, he retained his deeply Calvinist morality and sense of ethics. During this time, he established a long friendship with the founder of the so-called Catholic Apostolic Church, Edward Irving, through whom he would later meet his wife. Despite the fact that he ultimately disobeyed their wishes for him to enter the priesthood, Carlyle never lost a strikingly deep admiration for his parents, the life they led, and their general sense of ethics. He always regarded himself as a lower stratum rural man like his father, who raised himself up in status via hard work and wise business practice. This would later influence his personal charity to the unfortunates of London, who he would often assist or shelter if they appealed to him so. In particular, Carlyle seemed to have an almost obsessive idea around his mother, whose memory would provide a striking emotional coda to his life, as we will see later. After completing his studies, Carlyle left Edinburgh and returned to his home county, where he took up a place at his old school of horrors, the Annan Academy, but this time as a mathematics teacher. He also taught this subject at a grammar school in Kirkcaldy until 1818. Notably, he is said to have solved an important mathematical problem given to him by a tutor, the physicist John Leslie. As such, to this day, a type of circle associated with the solution to various quadratic problems is known as the Carlyle circle. But once again, Carlyle's main passion was changing. He learned German and became deeply immersed in that country's literature. He published a biography of the life of Schiller, which was published in the London Magazine throughout 1823 and 1824. This is where the Carlyle we know now begins to come together. Carlyle became a kind of German idealist, though he would later reject this philosophy, and began to widely propagate major German books that he himself translated. Before long, he was effectively the most prominent expert on German literature in Scotland, and by some accounts, England too. He seems to have been fully engaged with the poetry and prose of the ongoing Romantic movement, both continentally and at home, penning articles on various related subjects, which appeared often in the enormous catalogue of Scottish intellectual magazines. Many of these, like Fraser's, took a strongly anti-reformist and Tory line in politics. One of their most famous contributors around this time was Mary Shelley, of Frankenstein fame. She rejected her father's highly liberal and humanistic work, and placed herself in the radical Tory school of comment. It is certain that Carlyle would have read her, and she him. Notably, Scotland, more so than England, had a network of speedy subscription posts, via which the popular magazines and pamphlets of the day would be sent out to even the most remote parts of the country. This made it possible for a strong intellectual life to thrive all over the place, from the Hebrides down to Hadrian's Wall. By 1824, Thomas Carlyle had effectively become a full-time writer, earning a decent enough living by writing scholarly articles for the various aforementioned magazines, and continuing to author well-received translations of German literature. Around this time, he also underwent a major spiritual reawakening. It consisted, he later explained, of a sudden clearing away of the doubts as to the beneficent organization of the universe, a semi-mystical conviction that he was free to think and work, and that honest effort and striving would not be thwarted by what he called the everlasting no, which is Carlyle's term for the spirit of unbelief in God. Soren Kierkegaard later drew on this principle to develop his own idea of the leap of faith, which will be covered in depth on this channel in the coming months. Jane Baillie Welsh was born in Haddington, Scotland, in July of 1801. She was a very well-educated girl by historical or modern standards. Indeed, she was known to have been extraordinarily well-read. She wrote a novel at the age of 13 and a 5-act drama not long after. She became a pupil of the aforementioned Edward Irving, through whom she was introduced to Thomas Carlyle. Their first meetings in 1821 were not remarkable. Jane found Carlyle quite brooding, and even at times wondered about his intellectual merit. When he attempted to be personable or romantic, he came across as the awkward country boy, which at heart he was. Jane was attractively slender, elegant, urbane, and despite her country roots, cosmopolitan. She was a noted beauty and possessed a delicate face, though at times her Scotch spirit came through, and she would resolve disputes with a fierce temper and a thirsting for violence. It seems that Carlyle became smitten with her forceful intellectual personality, though not much is known of their courtship. Jane's mother thought that Carlyle was subordinate to Jane in both social standing and intellectuality, but nevertheless they married in 1826. Jane was 25, Carlyle 31. Before I go any further with the life of Thomas Carlyle, I must make some further comments on Jane. Although Jane Carlyle published nothing in her lifetime, she wrote an enormous quantity of letters and diaries, most of which were available in print and with commentary. She evidently possessed great literary skill, but chose not to publish for reasons unknown. The new couple moved to Jane's modest agricultural estate at Craigenputtock. Carlyle rather enjoyed the tranquil life he lived there, and wrote of the place,
"It is certain that for living and thinking in, I have never since found in the world a place so favourable."
It was at Craigenputtock that Carlyle wrote some of his most famous collections of essays on a variety of figures and concepts, including the famous piece on Dr. Francia, the dictator of Paraguay. Most important of the works completed at Craigenputtock, however, was the novel Sartor Resartus, meaning literally the tailor retailored. Sartor Resartus is a demonstration of Carlyle's essentially humorous nature. A complete dissection of the work could fill many volumes, and perhaps will be covered on this channel in the future. But in the most simple terms, it is a satire on German idealism and academic frivolity. It also contains powerful philosophical commentary on forms and spirituality, adopting a Fichtean stance on religious conversion as an explicit rejection of evil by the free soul. The novel was successful, both in the British Isles and abroad. Practically every major American figure of the 19th century read it with admiration, including Dickinson, Thoreau, and Melville. The novel, like most of Carlyle's work, is predictive of many 20th century movements in literature, appearing at once to be a work of existentialism with some postmodern aspects, and a heavy sense of magical realism. The work is particularly far-reaching in that it often comments on the intellectual and mechanical effort of assembling it.
He who first shortened the labour of copyists by device of movable types was disbanding hired armies and cashiering most kings and senates and creating a whole new democratic world. He had invented the art of printing.
Walt Whitman remarked that without Carlyle and his Sartor Resartus, British letters of the 1800s would have been like an army with no artillery. Indeed, the book acted effectively as a howitzer shell, fired from quiet Craigenputtock deep into the bustling heart of literary London. Carlyle's burgeoning fame and intellectual credibility drew him and Jane into a life in Chelsea, where indeed they would reside for the rest of their lives. They arrived there in 1837. Almost immediately, Carlyle struck up friendships with most of London's literary elite, including the essayist Leigh Hunt and the philosopher J.S. Mill. Though Carlyle would spend the bulk of his life in London from then on, it seems to have suited him very poorly. He had developed some form of digestive ulceration in the 1820s, and this left him in a great deal of discomfort and pain, exacerbated by his urban surroundings. Much of his bad temper can be attributed to his condition. Carlyle also found the living aspects of Chelsea highly interruptive to his meditative nature, and as such his work began to suffer. The streets of the capital were constantly thronged with marketeers, fruit sellers, amusement hawkers, organ grinders, preachers, horse traffic, and noisy animals. Even compared to Edinburgh, this was intolerable for a man such as Carlyle. Later, he embarked on an expensive project to have the highest room of his three-floor house heavily soundproof to keep out the din. However, it was only once the work was finished and a raised skylight had been added that Carlyle realized his costly alterations had now made the room the noisiest in the house, but nevertheless, he gritted his teeth and continued on to work. What made life in London yet more difficult for Carlyle, though, was the growing animosity between him and Jane. They often had vicious disputes over minor things and were observed to be very miserable with each other. Around this time in her letters and diaries, Jane candidly admitted that she had married Carlyle without ever having actually fallen in love with him. Her real passion had been for her tutor, Edward Irving, Although it must be said that, unlike the other famous artistic marriages of the period, such as the Dickenses, the Ruskins, and the Thackeray's, it did not end in separation or despair. The two remained basically committed to each other. Domestically, Jane tended to take her frustrations out on the staff. Over the course of 20 years, Jane hired and fired some 37 individual maids. Apparently, she had a habit of showing the maids how real work was meant to be done, which caused endless friction and offence. Really, Jane had very little need to even hire a maid. She was the sort of woman who, despite her intellectual gifts, truly did relish the hard labour of 19th century housework, though the noise was often of great disturbance to her husband. Although there is no indication that either of the two ever committed an infidelity, they certainly had rather close relationships with outside partners. Jane became perilously smitten with the exiled Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini, and which left Carlyle even more volcanically tempered than usual. He himself established an affectionate friendship with the socialite and intellectual Lady Harriet Montague. Montague had a reputation for being something of a seductress, and despite admiring her intellectual, and indeed her social gifts, the austere, gaunt, and domestically wanting Jane found the gourmandish, plump, sumptuously attired and housed Baroness far too much of a danger to her husband's self-control. Though Carlyle probably never physically desired Lady Montague, Jane nevertheless gave him the most legendary harangues for the amount of time he spent in the hostess's company. But perhaps the most striking aspect of the marriage was that it was probably never consummated. Some biographers have suggested that Carlyle himself was impotent, but more likely, for whatever reason, the couple simply did not derive physical pleasure from each other, though in their respective youths, they were both considered highly attractive people. Jane's diaries seem to imply, and I stress imply, that Carlyle had some kind of aversion to actual sex, though the two also kept an intimate physical proximity, sleeping and living together for the remainder of their married lives. Overall, I think the best summation of the marriage of Jane and Thomas Carlyle can be summed up by a quote from Samuel Butler. "It was very good of God to let Mr. and Mrs. Carlyle marry, so as to make two people miserable instead of four." In 1837, Carlyle made his definitive step into the London intelligentsia, and he began to write his 3-volume work, The French Revolution, a History. Famously, the story goes that as his friend J.S. Mill was reviewing the draft of the first volume, his illiterate maid took it to be a piece of scrap paper and threw it onto the fire. Mill, distraught and white as a sheet, appeared at Carlyle's front door to report what had happened. Carlyle took the news with the utmost stoicism, making very little fuss, and even declining the offer of £100 from Mill as compensation. Personally, I've always been a little puzzled over the story. After all, Mill's maid was employed in the house of a very prolific writer. Bits of unfinished and drafted work would surely have been strewn all over the place, and though she may have been illiterate, a heavily bound draft manuscript is evidently not what one might have decided was scrap paper. But nevertheless, we only have the story as history delivers it to us. Carlyle worked quickly, and after completing the second and third volumes, rewrote the first largely from memory. Once again, Carlyle's book was a major hit, and again, its style was highly forward-looking and experimental. Its prose is far removed from the analytical narrative history common of his day. The book employs a furious pace, and almost a novelistic tone. Perhaps its most admiring reader was Charles Dickens, who utilized both the prose and the history for his work A Tale of Two Cities. He apparently would lug the entire 3-volume set of Carlyle's book around with him wherever he went, and he quoted it incessantly. The work was followed immediately by the famous book on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history. In this book, Carlyle compared a vast range of religious, artistic, and political people. This book, which was originally a series of lectures, effectively launched the great man theory of historical study, though it should be noted that Carlyle's actual historical writing differs significantly from the later, more deliberate great man historiographies written in the 20th century. Furthermore, Carlyle was never one to advocate for a superheroic archetype. He was well aware that all men were flawed on the precondition of being man. Carlyle attacked those critics who criticized heroes for their flaws and termed this mode valetism. The idea that being a valet, and yes, it is pronounced valet, as Woodhouse readers will know, who helps his master with menial chores will always hold his master in a mundane and basic light, whereas those who only see the great deeds will have the opposite view. After all, the man who faces Napoleon's armies and observes his generalship will not bear a similar view of him to the man who helps him get his trousers on in the morning. Carlyle then began to distance himself from the reformist current of his day, with the book Past and Present, in which he attacked the condition of the English and argued that only hard work truly sets men free from themselves. After all, England was a rich country, indeed one of the richest of the time, but its streets were thronged with paupers and idle men. In this work, Carlyle basically endorses a return to the monastic institution, which provided both spiritual and material aid to the unfortunates of the kingdom. For reference, this theme is greatly expanded upon in the writings of G.K. Chesterton, who will certainly receive an extensive set of videos on this channel next year. After that came a great and infamous controversy. In October 1865, a large group of freedmen in Jamaica provoked a minor riot outside the colony courthouse, in which some were killed by the local militia. This developed into a regional uprising, and fearing a repeat of the bloody troubles in Haiti half a century before, the governor, John Eyre, put down the unrest with maximum force, imprisoning all suspected revolutionaries and executing a wealthy mixed-race man, G.W. Gordon. Martial law was declared colony-wide. It was the most severe case of unrest in the history of the British West Indies. Back in Britain itself, the intellectual elite of the time began to divide over the issue. Due to his actions, Governor Eyre was to be brought back and tried for mass murder. J.S. Mill spearheaded the Jamaica Committee, which sought to have Eyre prosecuted. It was comprised of radical liberal MPs, as well as Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, and T.H. Huxley. In opposition, a leading Tory, Lord Manners, formed the Eyre Defence Committee alongside Carlyle, who acted as the main intellectual heavyweight, along with Lord Cardigan, who had led the charge of the Light Brigade a decade prior, Carlyle's friend, John Ruskin, Lord Tennyson the poet, and author Charles Dickens. Ultimately, both a High Court trial and a private lawsuit decided that Eyre had acted reasonably and acquitted him on all charges. The whole affair had a striking effect on Carlyle. It essentially ended his comradeship with J.S. Mill, whose ideas he began to publicly repudiate. He also started to examine the condition of the West Indian blacks, who had been freed from British slavery in 1833. He penned a rather odd but highly controversial pamphlet titled Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question, and later reissued it with an altered title that present circumstances prevent me from saying on this channel. Carlyle felt that the Negro population of the West Indies was essentially feckless, and in his work, the whimsical narrator says,
If Kwashi will not honestly aid in bringing out those sugars, cinnamons, and nobler products of the West India Islands for the benefit of all mankind, then, I say, neither will the powers permit Kwashi to continue growing pumpkins there for his own lazy benefit, but will shear him out by and by like a lazy gourd overshadowing rich ground, him and all that partake with him, perhaps in a very terrible manner.
In essence, Carlyle cannily observed the fact that certain groups, both ethnically and otherwise, have a tendency to allow themselves to live in idle squalor, and as such, if England was to bother to lord over Kwashi, as he named the typical West Indian, at all, then they should be made to work and be productive. Contrary to popular understanding, Carlyle never advocated for a system of chattel slavery, but rather pointed out the cruelty of making all the blacks, quote, free, then leaving them to their own underprepared minds. Surely, Carlyle argued, to be made to work in some capacity and to feel the benefits of productivity was a better life than lying in idle squalor as they were prone to do. Ultimately, Carlyle's views became more and more steadfast, and before long he was attacking reformers not just in the colonies, but in the Parliament of Great Britain. He lamented the decline of politics into a mass franchise electorate, pointing out that a properly captained ship does not open its command to the votes of the crew and passengers. By now, with the 1860s well underway, and the seeds of universal suffrage laid by both Tory and Liberal ministries, Carlyle's views began to alienate him from the polite intellectual society he had been a part of, though by now he had become a household name among the literate public, and his books were selling so well that the usually hard-up scribbler now had more money than he knew what to do with, though of course his austere Protestant mentality prevented any profligacy. In the meantime, he had begun to write a history of the life of Frederick the Great. Though Carlyle could often write with a lightning-fast pen, this book became a hideous quagmire to get through. He made several trips to Germany in order to study the battlefields and primary sources, and also sought to make a philosophy book out of the piece. He felt that Frederick's achievements were evidence of a spiritual awakening in Germany, actively opposed to the liberalism of the Enlightenment. Carlyle vividly recreated many of Frederick's battles in his pages, arguing that they were an example of one man bringing order to a state of bloody and extreme chaos. Despite his clear vision for the book, Carlyle eventually denigrated it as his 13 years' war with Frederick the Great, and often even refusing to speak of it while he was trying to work on it. Eventually, it ran to 6 large volumes. Along the way, Carlyle was troubled by even worse than usual marital difficulties with Jane, a particularly bad and often literally explosive bout of intestinal trouble, and an increasingly mixed reception as each volume of the book appeared. This took such a heavy toll on the Sage of Chelsea that he began to develop psychosomatic trouble, not helped by his inability to sleep properly in the noisy Chelsea townhouse. Carlyle's life from then on was increasingly difficult. His fame brought him rewards, such as a nomination as the Lord Rector of Edinburgh University, the inaugural ceremony of which he used as an opportunity to just harangue the students about the benefits of hard work. But only 3 weeks after, Jane, who had been ill for some time, died. Despite the cold and argumentative nature of their relationship, which remained so until her demise, Carlyle was devastated. He coped very badly without her, and after finding her letters and her diaries, wrote a highly self-critical recollection of their married life together, in which he lamented that he had treated her appallingly and wished that she was still alive so that he could beg her forgiveness. The book was published only after the death of Carlyle by the biographer J.A. Froude. His last years were spent hankering to return to the estate at Craig and Puttock, though ultimately Carlyle would never leave London again. In 1874, he was considered to be the eminent man of letters in Britain, and as such, both Queen Victoria and her favourite Benjamin Disraeli put forward that he should receive the Order of the Knight of the Bath, along with a pension. This came partially as compensation, since so many notable scientists were receiving awards that the arts, by comparison, looked neglected. Disraeli's championing of Carlyle came as a shock to just about everyone, not least Carlyle himself. He remarked to Ruskin that Disraeli was
a conscious juggler, a superlative Hebrew conjurer. He is the only man I almost never spoke of except with contempt, and if there is anything of scurrility anywhere chargeable against me, he is the subject of it. And yet see, here he comes, with a pan of hot coals for my guilty heed.
Though Carlyle would decline the honour, he was grateful, and his official answer to Disraeli read,
Titles of honour, of all degrees, are out of keeping with the tenor of my poor life, and as for money, after years of rigorous and frugal but, thank God, never degrading poverty, it has become amply abundant, even superabundant in this later time. Nevertheless, the proposal is magnanimous and noble, without example in the history of governing persons with men of letters.
and though he always preferred the ministries of the unicorn Disraeli to the lion Gladstone, upon Disraeli's last ministry he said of him,
Accursed old Jew, not worth his weight in cold bacon, an accursed being, the worst man who ever lived.
A notable event late in Carlyle's life was his sitting for the portrait, an arrangement in grey and black number 2, of the American artist James McNeill Whistler, then in residence in London. He visited the artist's studio, not far from his own house, where he was particularly impressed by the previous piece, arrangement in grey and black, portrait of the artist's mother, more commonly known as Whistler's mother. Carlyle appreciated the austere and simple nature of the piece, as well as the profile view of the sitter. Carlyle ended up sitting for the painting regularly in Whistler's studio from the end of 1872 to the summer months of 1873. Several visitors observed the sitting, and one, the artist Hugh Cameron, said, "It was the funniest thing I ever saw. There was Carlyle sitting motionless, like a heathen god or an oriental sage, and there was Whistler, hopping about like a sparrow." Throughout the process, Carlyle's usual melancholy worsened, and he wrote, "More and more dreary, barren, base, and ugly seem to me all the aspects of this poor diminishing quack world." Like many reactionaries, Carlyle was undergoing the melancholy of realizing that everything that he detested, everything he warned against, everything he hoped via literature to prevent, would come to pass. The world was fast descending into a democratic quagmire. Thomas Carlyle passed away on the 5th of February, 1881. He was eligible to be buried in Westminster Abbey, but instead he chose to be buried with his parents, all the way back in remote Ecclefechan, from where he came. His official last words were rather bold, "So, this is death. Well." But before he died, he is said to have whispered weakly, "My mother." Only a year later, an authorized biography appeared, written by Carlyle's friend J.A. Froude. Froude attempted to imbue the piece with Carlyle's own principles in writing history, and at this he partly succeeded. But to the increasingly vulgar late Victorian society, what made the book most notable were the frank descriptions of the marital trouble between Carlyle and Jane. Over time, the book became a quintessential example of the hidden troubles of long and loyal matrimonies. After all, if the seemingly ultra-Protestant old vulture of reactionary morality could have such a difficult and loveless marriage, how on earth could the rest of the country honestly keep up the institution themselves? In the end, Carlyle had stood astride the 1800s, bearing and analysing its dips and its peaks. He was present from the age of the Regency Romantics up to the late Victorian Realists. Even though his actual warnings were often ignored by the elites of his life, his work has been read and analysed constantly since his death, a mark of distinction few reactionary authors can claim. Carlyle influenced both the coming of the left and the right in their actions. His words remain both definitive in their subjects, and his wit remains one of the greatest in literature. Therefore, I put to this audience that if they have not already done so, they should seek to purchase as much of the great man's writing as possible, on paper and not through a screen. The prose will draw you in on style alone, but the probity and wit of the substance will keep you in. Your views will be simultaneously confirmed and yet shaken. You will laugh and yet be left disturbed. To paraphrase the man himself, in his books lies the soul of the whole past time, the articulate, audible voice of the past, when the body and material substance of it has altogether vanished like a dream.